Hi everyone, my name's Jordan. I'm going to do a little song and dance and get anxious and try to make jokes and watch your deadpan stares at me and try even harder for about the next hour, 45 minutes.
Sounds good.
Okay. And I had to give a punny name. So bringing game design to a knife fight, lessons learned from 10 years of combat design by Jordan Ajlouni. Section 1, intro. This is a template, and it had animations, and I thought they were funny, so I kept them. So, ooh, ooh. What is this talk? To jump right in, I did make that art thanks to a meme generator. This talk is a shout out to combat design. I'm a combat designer. I think it is fun and useful to get the chance to hop into something a little more specific. I know clubs like this, we tend to keep it at a very high level and speak in larger platitudes, and I'll still do that, and it'll be vague, and hopefully you'll pull something out from it. But it'll be under the guise that this is combat design. But on a broader sense, these are design lessons through the lens of combat. I really do think I pull stuff out of them for non-combat design and creativity in general, and I hope you can pull some as well. I'm going to try to give examples where I can, but it is the industry. The current project I'm working on, where I'm pulling a lot of this from, has not been announced. So NDA, NDA, NDA. My apologies. Just invite me back when we do announce it, and I'll maybe just recycle the same talk and just swap out the examples. How about that? This is told through real-time action combat. That is my forte. There's a lot of different types of combat, but I've honed in on action. And at the end of each of my lessons I have to share, there will be a takeaway, hopefully to sum it all up and for you to utilize. But I want to put in a big asterisk here. There are no universal truths in game dev. There's no universal truths in design. Maybe in life. That's not what this talk's about. That's the next club. That's the next presentation. So I will maybe go against some of my lessons. They'll contradict themselves. You will be able to poke holes in them. Good. These are heuristics. These are lenses. These are not universal rules. I'd like to give a quick overview. Where I'm going to start with an intro to the talk. That's where we are now. Then I'm going to spoilers talk about who I am. Then I'm going to take a very bold step, or no, that's later. I'm not going to define combat design. I think it's useful to make sure we're all on the same page about specifically what I'm talking about, what the role is, kind of where the career trajectory is, where you can go with it. And then I'm going to take a very bold one slide to define good combat design, and then the presentation's over and we all go home. No, then it's a big shotgun blast of lessons I learned, little sections of little wisdoms I hope you find interesting. It's always hard to gauge these types of talks. There's a wide variety of people, but I'm going to hit you really fast. I'm going to talk faster the more bored you get. We're going to get through it. And then there's going to be time for questions. You like that animation? I didn't do it. The template did. I know. So who am I? Why am I the one giving the talk? Hi, I'm Jordan. I'm a game designer with over 12 years of experience. This is me eating fugazeta down in Argentina. If you haven't had fugazeta, okay. So fugazeta in Argentina, they have a large injection of Italian culture down there, and so they have an offshoot of pizza called fugazeta, and there's no sauce. The dough's a little tackier, and they use a saltier, kind of, in a good way, stinkier cheese, and they bake it with onions on top and they caramelize, and it was wonderful. And now the only thing you've learned from that section is that I'm very food driven. I'm essentially a walking golden retriever. But also, why you should care about me talking for an hour at you is I'm currently lead designer at Sword and Wand. We're about, I've been there 18, 19 months. I am lead designer, and I should say lowercase f founder. I was there through all the steps. We're currently VC funded as of fall, which is super good, which is super awesome. It's a whole process. We're focusing on meaningful co-op experiences. Our tagline is, a lot of co-op games have you play alone next to each other, and we want games where you actually play with each other. I know that can sound very like Peter Molyneux platitudes, sort of big promises, but we are staying inside the core co-op genre and market, but just trying to amp up what it means to actually interact with each other. We're about 11 full-time employees, 20 including our contractors right now, a design team of 3. me included. And all I can say is currently working on a third-person action game that is co-op, because we are a co-op studio. I encourage you to check out our website to see our values. We are not currently recruiting right now, or actively recruiting for any roles, but we're always looking for opportunity hires, particularly engineers, because y'all are expensive and rare, and we need you at all times. Before Sword and Wand, I've done a lot of things, a lot of things. I've been a Unity contractor. I've been a gameplay programmer that was out in California at Way Forward. I've been an indie developer. Maybe some of you remember some of our oil leak games, submissions to locally sourced mag. I've been in game startups outside of college. I've been in non-game startups doing VR stuff in San Francisco. And most importantly for this talk, I was a combat designer and lead designer on Agents of Mayhem Expedition for over 4 years. I'm a combat designer to my core. It's where I started. It's where I'm comfortable. It's where I do my best work. It's where my mind naturally goes. Now you're probably asking yourself, did I add this GIF because it's vaguely combat related, or am I implying I'm actually capable at this, either literally or figuratively through game design? The latter. Moving on, defining combat design. Thank you. I think it's important to just make sure we're on the same page entering this. One thing I really like about combat, again, I did not make this. This looks nice, not me. It's the template, I'm willing to admit. One thing I really like about combat design is it is this rapid fire collision of so many different parts of game development that have to happen really quickly. So there's a lot of different elements here, and it's always worth talking about. You have your core gameplay, you have your player mechanics, what the player's doing. You have enemies to complement those players. You get into enemy design, more importantly, enemy AI design, which is its whole own field. You always dabble in some amount of balancing and progression. Sometimes you own it, sometimes it's a different department. But since you understand the design space of your combat, it is inevitable that you're going to understand how it expands and how it should be balanced and how the player should progress through it over time. And then you should be thinking a lot about UI and UX because your combat needs to be understandable. You'll rarely have to spearhead that, those are other departments, but you better be thinking about what those things mean to your combat experience from your initial design, and you will be a part of those conversations. A good note about UX, I know in other industries, UX is about wireframes and navigating through interfaces. We, maybe incorrectly at our company, use it for the broader player, the readability of your gameplay. So this is including things like color language and the tells for how big an explosion is. That all falls under there. That's a big part of combat, and I'll cover a little bit of that later. So what is a combat designer? If these are all the things that go into combat design, really it's an intersection of gameplay design and systems design. And right there in the middle of the Venn diagram, you'll have your combat designers. Combat designers, there are two umbrellas that a combat designer can live under, like I said. There's systems and gameplay. What umbrella you live more under in your role really depends on your game type, your studio size, things like that. The quick rule of thumb is that action games equal gameplay designer, and more tactics and strategy games equal systems designer. That's a quick heuristic, that's not a universal rule. But also I think role types are kind of silly for design. You can quote me on that, that's fine. A design position can mean so many different things at so many different studios that at the end of the day, you just need to read the job description carefully and make sure the tasks they're asking you to do line up with what you want to do. I interviewed for a game systems designer position, and it was a programming position, and I was not ready for that whiteboard programming test. Let me tell you, it was rough. So, like, if it helps you understand your role, if it helps you understand your job, use the title. You'll need to put it on a resume, but at the end of the day, try to be flexible and understand what's the possibility space, what the studio actually wants. So I'm going to do something very bold after the animation. Oh, yeah. Am I an animator? I just spent 10 minutes defining combat design. I am not myself. So I'm going to try to answer the question of what is good combat design. And in doing so, I kind of realized that really I'm asking what is good game design in general. So in a single slide, I'm going to do the very ambitious thing of giving a universal answer that has solved our industry and we can just get jobs elsewhere and actually get paid a decent amount. This is in actuality, this is something I've been working on. A definition that's helped day to day is not going to be absolute. I'm going to have different opinions on this in 2 weeks probably, but I think it's been helpful for me, so I wanted to share. Good game design focuses on the relationship and impact of ideas to create a specific experience for the player. The real emphasis here is on relationship and impact. More and more, my job is not about creating the ideas. There's often a misconception of an idea champion or an ideas guy, or just being the source of an idea, being the source of ideas on the team, no matter what your role is. But that's a fallible focus. As a designer, you are trying to make sure that the ideas come together to actually craft something, to actually yield something. And it doesn't matter where they come from, and it's your job to juggle them and communicate them more than it is to come up with them. If you come up with them, awesome. If they come from somewhere else, also awesome. If you're told that's just what they have to be in there, and you have to interpret it, that's probably more like what would actually happen. Yeah, actually. Section 4. Now we're going to enter the bulk of the talk. I have a bunch of lessons here, a bunch of shock and blasted lessons, and let me know when I hit time. I can stop early. I just threw them all in there. My timing of this talk when I practice would fluctuate depending on how nervous or verbose I was being. And if we don't get through all of them, you'll just have to have me back, and I'll have to give another talk. Oh no! Yeah, leave you all with a nice little cliffhanger. So we can dive right in, but first. Oh, yeah, you like that? Jumping right in, lesson 1, all hail game feel. Your game has to feel good. I hope this isn't a shock to anyone. The reality is there's a dichotomy of game feel that I have found, and it's very simple. If your game feels good, players will enjoy playing it. And if your game is frustrating, confusing, awkward, or inconsistent, I don't care how cool the ideas are when they actually come together, or if you spend 40 hours diving in, your game is bad. And I don't mean to be harsh, but this is the lens I take on our own work at day-to-day at Squadron 1. It's an important, very important aspect for appealing to your player and maintaining your player's attention. So what do you do if this dichotomy exists? Well, very simply, you prioritize game feel early. You consider it as part of an initial implementation. Every day, we put in a new, I should say, overall at work, I'm very proud. One thing we've done is we maintain a playable build. We play it every Thursday as a team. I've been on too many projects where people on the team haven't even opened the game once and aren't on the same page. And we have very iteration-focused workflow. We're in the second half of pre-production right now. This might change a little bit in production, of course, but our motto is like, get it in the build. We'll see it in the build, we'll play test it, it's easier to collaborate. And since we're seeing everything through the lens of actually playing the game, we put a lot of extra effort to make sure the game feel is good, to make sure it's smooth and understandable, and that the teammates who haven't sat in all of our combat meetings can understand what's going on. And we hammer that in early. And we will fix bugs and tweak things that we know are going to be rewritten in a couple months because we think that is that important to make sure we have that game experience done. This also includes UX and readability of your combat. Something can be implemented, but if someone can't understand it or interact with it, it might as well not be implemented. The last thing on this that I like to focus on is context matters. Every player you have is bringing in some sort of previous knowledge from previous games or their understanding of the real world. And if you can tap into that for your players or your fellow developers, they are often just as much the person you're appealing to through development as is a normal player. You can help communicate your ideas. Your game can actually be more playable. What do I mean by this? Is I try to be very careful not to put a lot of flavor if I'm naming an ability that I've designed or that we're implementing. I try to keep things pretty straightforward. There's a team of world builders and a team of writers. I claim to be neither. You can probably find some of my creative writing back from high school somewhere out there. It's not good. You don't want me to be writing things. But I do make sure to inject just enough flavor that something can get across. A very simple and straightforward example of this is like, if you have an explosion, go find an explosion VFX, actually put it in. Players come understanding things about an explosion that they'll project into your game. And having a flashing sphere may technically represent everything you need to know, but go find an asset pack and put in that explosion. They'll have a specific experience with that will really help accelerate their understanding of what's going on, accelerate their understanding of the combat. A specific example of why this all adds up to good game feel and the game feel is important is I think about this time in Agents of Mayhem quite often. We had an engineer who made a very, very smart decision that at the time I didn't even fully realize. You see in Agents of Mayhem, who's played Agents of Mayhem? One hand, okay, you're my new best friend. The game, the game flopped, just so everyone knows. I've accepted it. My therapist has heard about it. We have all moved on. But there was a lot of good things that went in the game. A lot of talented people worked on it. And it was an extensive and impressive game in a lot of ways, even though it didn't have market success. But one of the mechanics in Agents Mayhem is when you're playing a game out on the field, you always have access to 3 characters, and you can instantly swap between them at any time. When you swap, it's very fluid. You even maintain your velocity in anim state of the previous character. We had a gameplay engineer. He was working on the character controller. That was his main focus for a year and a half to 2 years. It was just a character controller. And he worked to iron out every microsecond in that transition. And then we were discussing what he would work on next and working with producers to schedule his time. And he got it pretty good. There was a little bit of a hitch, a little bit of a technical thing that he couldn't quite iron out. And he goes, listen, to get rid of that hitch, it'll take me over a month. I need to rewrite the character controller to iron out how we handle animations to just save that 1 microsecond. And we're like, okay, well, you can move on to other stuff. He's like, no, I'm going to spend that month to iron out that microsecond. And it was such an insightful, you meet people on different disciplines who just have a good design sense of what the experience needs to be. He had a great one. And he knew that if that mechanic felt bad, it was bad. And he went that extra mile for that, just little extra smoothness on our core mechanic. But our whole game was built off of it, so it was very important. So the takeaway is that game feel is functional. You should consider it part of it. You should consider it as part of your functional pass. It needs to feel good the first time it's implemented. Lesson 2, we develop what's in front of us. The reality is, for you yourself, subconsciously, for your team, maybe more consciously, not necessarily subconsciously, you're going to build off of what's actually in your game, especially if people are playing it and you're actually iterating on it. This means that you want to make sure your intent is present in the side of the build. You want to start with the most important mechanics. This is just as much about design as it is about production. In the more classical waterfall style of production, the general idea is you're developing everything at once. That creates a very uneven experience in your game. A team might be ahead, or they might have a smaller feature and they might knock it out faster, but it's a tertiary feature. It doesn't really impact the core mechanics. Suddenly, it's confusing what you're supposed to be focusing on as a fellow developer, of how the game state, of what your long-term intent is. Instead, and we do this at Sword and Wand, there is a radial style of development. And the idea is you take a target, and each ring is an important mechanic or feature of your game, and you work outward, and you complete each ring as much as you can. It's not always smooth or perfect, but you complete each ring before you move on to the next one. so that when the triage happens, when you have to start bandaging and making deep cuts and bandaging wounds on your game, you can remove outer rings of the production and still have the core identity of your game. Your game is still functional. This general idea translates into the day-to-day. People are going to interact with your game, internalize it, other developers, and they're going to start making decisions around what is there. Whether or not it's the funny mini game someone put in on their free Friday, or it is your core mechanic. Ideally, you want to make sure it's your core mechanic. There's a flip side to this, where people can focus on the wrong thing and actually veer off course without realizing it. So sometimes I cut something that people like because they're getting really into it. Not cut it, but maybe temporarily remove from build. They're getting really into it, and I don't want us to start adding content around it, start building levels around an individual feature. You need to remove it, maybe put more emphasis in something else, find a better time to reintroduce it. It doesn't have to be cut forever, but this game is a living thing that people are adapting to. So the takeaway for this one's a little shorter. Maintain your intent. Make sure the core of your game is present inside your current build, and if you do that, development will be smoother and more inspired by what you're actually making. Lesson 3. So I have like 80s. How are we doing? Everyone doing okay?
Good.
Good? Okay. Okay. I don't have. I realize I don't have enough jokes in here. The animation bit, there's like 40 slides till we hit the next one. So. You guys are doing great. Just keep with me.
We'll just do it with the books.
I was going to say, do you just want to do it at your lesson slides?
I'll tell you what, yeah. How about this? Lesson 3. Player abilities need challenges.
Ooh.
Yes, there we go. Yeah. Oh, I saw the emojis. Excellent. Tell me if the story sounds familiar. It's a story I've fallen into and I've seen other people fall into. Hell yeah. New prototype. Ignore the 8 other prototypes currently in your repository. It's time to start a brand new one. And you are super excited. So where do you start? Player mechanics, obviously. We're going to start with the cool idea of what the player's actually doing. They're rad, you get them in. They look cool and they feel cool for about 2 seconds. Something about them is still unsatisfying. The combat as a whole hasn't come together. More polish then. That's obviously the solution. Let's double down. Let's make it look cleaner and nicer and smoother. But still, that combat isn't quite getting there. I see this a lot, and this isn't necessarily a quality judgment for a lot of the games that I see on Twitter. I'm sorry, X. No, not poking that can of worms. Up here, think we're here, focus here. I see a lot of, like, really, a lot of cool looking games that do well in those like small little videos. They tend to be like developed by people who are artists first, and man, they look snappy. The animations are smooth. They're an action game. There's it's really looking good, but they seem a little hollow. If you look close, you can't actually project your experience over 2 hours, 4 hours, 10 hours on that game. That just might be what they're showing. They're showing demos at a time. I really don't want to snap talk those people. I follow them because I'm inspired by them. But it's something I realize. And the reason this is because player actions exist to overcome challenges. Your verbs are not enough. You need goals for these verbs to actually make sense. You need to give the player something to use their verbs on. A mechanic without context cannot be satisfying. If you don't have something to actually hit with your ability, if you don't have a puzzle to solve with your gravity gun, it is nothing more than a little toy that you're going to get bored with pretty quickly. I think a great example of this is Mario's Jump. We all know Mario's Jump. We all have internalized it. It has defined most of modern video games, blah, blah, blah. We know. So, but let's break it down a little bit, right? Imagine you're playing Mario, the classic Mario, or your favorite Mario of choice. Anyone, what's your favorite Mario game?
Super Mario Odyssey.
Odyssey, okay.
I say Galaxy.
Got it. 3. Oh, NES. The correct answer was Super Mario World. It's the best Mario. I apologize. But imagine, I got a mushroom. Thank you, Discord. Mario, can you picture your favorite Mario just jumping in a blank level? He can even be polished and all his assets and physics are good. But that doesn't really seem interesting. That gets boring really quick. So you add even just some simple gaps to jump. Suddenly this becomes compelling. You can see in the classic Mario 1-1, I'm clearing this obstacle. And then you start putting more spins on it. There are now Goombas, and instead of avoiding a large space with your jump, you are asked to land on a specific space with your jump, adding a new angle to the same mechanic. It's the same mechanic that existed in that blank level that wasn't fun on its own, but now it's given context. Then you add Koopas, and they're similar to Goombas, but then you have them eject from their shell. And now if you jump on the shell, you now have your jump as a tool to turn it into a ranged weapon because the shell goes flying and so on and so on. And I'm just really teaching you how Nintendo just designs their things, but the simple mechanic is suddenly compelling. You should really have this in mind when you're developing your own combat system, because the takeaway here is you need to build challenges for your mechanics. Your mechanics need something to do. What mechanics are used for is just as important as polishing that core experience. You should be moving on to the challenges, moving on to the enemies, moving on to the level design earlier than you think, earlier than you'd like. Because that's what is actually going to define the game experience for your player. That's what they're actually going to be doing. And you don't polish in a vacuum. Lesson 4, balance your complexity budget.
Ooh.
Okay, this side of the room is kind of letting me down a little bit. I admit, I want to admire the commitment over here. So just, I have no sway over your day-to-day or your life once you leave this room, but I'm disappointed. Okay. I'm hamming it up. I'm trying to keep you guys focused up here. I'm sorry. Every game has a complexity budget. And a complexity budget is how much you can give to the player before they become overwhelmed. How much do you expect of the player before they become overwhelmed? And it's always easy to add more to your game. You want to solve a problem, there's some hole in your experience, let's add a new feature. And then you add a new feature, well, that feature has to exist in the game world, and maybe there's some more UI around it, there's more VFX layered on top of it. It's always easy to add more, but in reality, everything has a cost to your game experience. And when I'm saying complexity, I mean conceptual complexity. Either them crunching the numbers behind the mechanics that they're experiencing and making decisions on, or the visual complexity of what they are seeing on screen. So you need to estimate your complexity. Right? You need to try to understand this ethereal thing. I say budget, but it isn't hard numbers. It is more of an intuitive sort of gut check up until you can play test. Play test is your only real hint. I'm going to talk about this image here. This is a great image because I think it sells it really well, even though it of itself is meant as a caricature or a joke. This is a World of Warcraft with all the custom mods on that some really hardcore player might use. And you just have a wall of UI, 8 different UIs, sizes, shapes, different bars, tons of text, extra numbers text inside of the combat itself, extra ability bars, the VFX of the enemy, the animations, if this were a GIF, would be going. You have your mini-map up in the corner. There's a lot going on. Now imagine showing this to someone playing World of Warcraft for the first time in the first hour. You have lost them. They cannot even parse it. They're not even going to Alt F4. They're going to just shut off the monitor and walk away. Right? So you need to start engaging with your complexity budget. And there's some ways to kind of try to figure it out. The rough equation you have is your budget is equal to your target market plus your genre. When you say target market, it's to no surprise that a casual gamer has a lot lower complexity threshold than a challenge gamer. The person who actually wants to get to this point in World of Warcraft is going to put up with a lot more of your complexity. Genre also has a huge impact because speed is an exponential modifier. The faster your game is, the more complex it technically is because you are asking more of the player every second they are playing the game. So genre has a huge impact. If you're playing a really twitchy shooter like Call of Duty, you have less room for mechanics and information than you do with a turn-based game. And don't forget, on top of all of that, it has to feel good. Putting the information on the screen isn't enough. The player needs to enjoy engaging with it. So I have a rule of thumb. on how to manage and assess your complexity budget. And it's pretty simple. Really, playtesting is the ultimate answer, but you can't always do that early on. You need to think about your complexity budget the second you start thinking about your design. The second you start your paper design, you should be thinking what it's going to look like long term. Thank you, I got ahead of myself. Yes, complexity decisions need to start before implementation, the second you come up with them. So a quick way, an easy way to assess your own complexity is, if you think it might be too complex, it is too complex. Don't even think about it any further, it's too complex. If you think it's fine, it's still too complex. And if you think it's too simple, you're getting there, it's just right, you're right there. The reality is, as a designer, or even just as a developer, you have normalized and internalized the game to such a degree, way more than your average player, even your experienced player. Maybe only your most dedicated speed running players can actually understand the game in the ways that you do. And so your tolerance for complexity is going to be higher than theirs. So you should just assume that it's lower. If you're unsure where it is, just default to rounding down. It's always been the right answer in my experience. Because on top of all that, on top of just the raw complexity, there's a hierarchy of importance. And this is both a useful tool and something to keep in mind. The emphasis matters. It's not just that the information is there. It's not just that it's on screen, but they are serving purposes and they are relative to each other. Remember, my definition of good game design is about how ideas interact less than the individual ideas. We need to make a balance for the player experience. And it's pretty simple. Important information needs more attention. I think this is a great screenshot. I think Back 4 Blood, maybe Left 4 Dead. Can't blame me for not knowing. They're very similar. It's Back 4 Blood? Okay, cool. Excellent. I think this is a pretty simple thing going on. It's not an overly complex moment, but it is just a great pinpoint of a hierarchy of information. There's something very important happening. They have highlighted it. They have put the red outline over the enemy that they want you to be aware of. They have a HUD icon, a ping system over them. Your character probably went, well, I think there's a hunter here. And then you hear the growls of the hunter. All of this is drawing your attention to it. But what is important is what's not there. They are not distracting you away from that. They aren't doing this for every enemy that shows up, for every little zombie. They are leaving space for this information because they understand what their hierarchy of information is. And it's important you can list out the hierarchy of information very early on in your game so you understand where all of this UX is going to funnel into down the road. So the little example I have is the complexity in Agents of Mayhem. Ultimately, we failed on this front. Agents of Mayhem is a very complex game. We have a lot of mechanics happening at real-time speed. You have 3 characters to manage. There are enemies all over that can surround you. They're firing guns at you. You're managing cooldowns of your abilities. You have ultimate abilities. There's enemies spawning in. You have lots of VFX firing off. On top of that, we didn't coordinate enough with the art team on what our visual complexity is, and they made a very dense and colorful near-future Seoul as the backdrop for the game, and it looks beautiful, but it is also very overwhelming when you layer all these combat elements I just pointed out on top of it. We realized that our complexity budget, we blew through our complexity budget too late. Unfortunately, we were in the second half of production when we play tested and finally accepted that reality. And the solution really was a complexity overhaul. We needed to completely reorganize things, maybe cut some features, reprioritize things, repace the game, but we didn't have time for that. So we just had to cut back and simplify where we could, still over our complexity budget at the end of the day. A great example of this was we had a Fresnel shader that we used to denote elite versions of enemies to kind of give a mini boss vibe. We had to cannibalize that because we also had a system where enemies had armor or shields and different weapons were effective against them to encourage you swapping between characters. And we were using like HUD elements to denote the armor and the shield. It wasn't enough. So we had to cut the elite information. I think we did develop a hierarchy of information and use that to give a yellow glow for armor when you needed to take down someone's armor. And somehow I scripted that in like our blueprint, and we shipped with it with my script. So that was cool. That happens sometimes. What we really should have done is better plan for visual complexity, left time in the production budget. I think mock-ups can really help. Had more meetings and more focus on it. Take a screenshot of your game at every milestone, paint over it, talk about what information is there and what is being assessed. And again, playtesting. I know playtesting can be frustrating, but it is infinitely useful. So design with your complexity in mind. What I always do when I have a design is I make the design of what my gut says, and then I ask myself, okay, cool, what is the simplest version of this feature that would still hit the high points? Maybe some of the super high complexity isn't there. Maybe some of the like really nerdy systems design stuff I'm trying to do doesn't pop off as much. But I'll be honest, every time I do this exercise, the thing that we should implement is closer to the bare bones version than it is the complex version. Lesson 5, a theory of kinetic energy in combat. Ooh. Yeah, you were ready. You were like, yes, I'm gonna get this one. Thank you, thank you. So kinetic energy, I'm not a physicist, scientist, engineer. I'm not gonna give you a formal definition of kinetic energy in our real world. This is a game development term I've been developing, I've been coining. I'm trying to get kinetic energy to take off. We'll see how it goes. It's really a lens to parse your mechanics and your game field to understand what you're developing. And it's pretty simple. When I say this mechanic has good kinetic energy, you're referring to a mechanic that usually involves some sort of movement or displacement. A potential energy mechanic, on the other side of things, is expressed through systems and numbers. It is something that's crunchier. And what I have found to be true, and this is vetted through all the different combats I've worked on, is that kinetic mechanics always have a bigger impact and are more satisfying. People always react to them more. It defines the experience for them. They are happier with it than anything numbers or systems based. Again, back to no universal truths. It really depends on your genre. I'm talking from a real-time action focus. So, apply it where you can. An example of kinetic system. I love this game. Okay, I love God of War and God of War Ragnarok, and just like that. This was like the best Dragon Ball Z fight from the first game that I could have ever designed. It felt good, and a lot of it was they were throwing you around. So kinetic systems, knockback is a big one. These are some examples. Any movement mechanics, even something as simple as sprinting. Charge and loop moves always feel really good, especially on enemies. They're cutting that distance. It adds a lot of intensity to the moment. Stagger and flinch systems, just as much about enabling movement, but depriving someone of movement, falls in the same vein. It falls under the kinetic energy. And shockwaves, having things that expand or move or consume space. So Elden Ring boss whose shockwaves expands out from under them, all fall under the kinetic system and I have found have that impact. An example of potential systems, anything that's really numerically focused. I refer to them as artificial mechanics. I don't mean this necessarily in a cruel way, but a lot of these tend not to be emergent from the simulation of a game world that you have set up. These tend to be a lot more under the hood. There aren't a lot of good examples that I could come up with universally, because they tend to be a little more game dependent, but a great one is like percent chance to critical hit, completely under the hood. Maybe if you have a headshot thing to crit, that's a little different. But if it's just 20% of the time your thing's going to hit, there's nothing about that is defined inside the real world that has that kinetic energy. And so I asked myself a question, why these kinetic mechanics feel good? I'm going to take a stab at it, but especially if any of you are into a more academic study of game development, I suggest Game Field by Steve Swink. He goes into this in much more detail than I can. But it really just has a bigger impact emotionally, and it feels more fulfilling. We know that, I went over that, but I think the reason is because it enhances the physicality and space of your combat, of your world. It is giving definition to the physics and the texture of what's actually happening there, and you are able to project a better real world understanding onto that game. and be inside a space, and it will feel better. It hits you on a more subconscious level than any under the hood sort of number things ever could. And Steve Schwein does a better job than me. I'm ad-libbing it and losing my voice from talking too much, and he wrote a whole book about it, so I'll defer it. Takeaway, invest in your kinetic mechanics. I design them in early. The first thing I ask these days or either I implement or ask for is knockback. I love knockback. It feels good every single time, and it's relatively easy to implement. Have them define your combat experience. Bake them into the core of your combat experience. You'll build off of it, and that should say boost, not booze. Little typo there. But you'll build off of it, and your game will flourish because of it. As far at least your game feel will. How are we on time? Because I'm
Good, 20 minutes.
Okay, I might get through all this after all. Lesson 6: game AI is hard.
Ooh.
Okay, that's the lesson. There wasn't much to it. Lesson 7: never be doing nothing. I'm just kidding. That was a joke. We'll talk a little bit more, not much more about game AI, but for real, it's hard. It's real hard. Like really, really hard. I think AI itself is a little bit of a trap. It's really easy to set up your simple AI. Really easy to have that enemy that just runs after your character and doesn't attack when it gets into range. But to take it to any other level beyond that is so hard. Like, it is its own career to be an AI engineer or an AI designer. When something has its own career around it, you're not going to just casually do it. I'm sorry. It's just, it's true for game development. It's true for trying to fix up something in your house. As a new homeowner, I feel this is every part of my life. I try to apply the lessons where I can. The reality is when you're working with AI, you can rarely tell it exactly what to do at exactly the right time. You are more building guidelines for it to react with. And so suddenly when you want some of the specific experiences or specific outcomes, it's a giant puzzle of behavior trees to actually get there. I could go on and on and on about this. It's really its own talk, if not its own class, and like a university level. Just shout out to, do you guys remember the Skyrim bug with covering I think that's just a great example. This giant company making this in-depth simulation. They have this illusion that they really want you to buy into, that you're a part of this place. And you can just casually put a bucket on someone's head and rob them blind. And like, you see the logic of that make perfect sense, right? The AI has some sort of vision, that they can see things in front of them, and if you obscure that vision in a very literal way, you can steal from them. And then they also have a mechanic where you can pick up things in the world. I don't even think you actually ever like meaningfully utilize that for gameplay. You can just pick things up and like rotate it, and it's kind of funny that you can manipulate that to just break entire systems with it. Did they ever patch that out?
I don't think so.
Okay, good. So the takeaway is really just don't underestimate your AI scope. It's a trap that we even have fallen into a couple times at our current company, despite like our 1,000 years of industry experience or whatever the number is. It's just always harder. It's just always harder. A great rule of thumb for any scope estimates is to take your scope, double it, then double it again. It's true for everything, but it's specifically true for AI. Back to the lesson 7. Never be doing nothing. Ooh. Okay, all right, we're coming back. Second wind. I like it. I like it. Good energy. Good energy. Combat is an illusion. It's an illusion that you are manifesting for the player, and the player wants to buy into it. We come to play video games because we want to play video games. We don't sit down at a video game to actively fight against it every moment if we're in good faith. I don't know, like, YouTube culture may say differently and try to poke holes in every little thing, but it is one big house of cards, and once it falls, you have lost the player. You need to keep the player engaged. I think this is a great example. Anytime you can just watch a full idle animation and see that it loops, and then you see the ridiculousness of it, of these characters. This is a training mode in, I think, the newest Street Fighter?
Second newest.
Second newest? Okay, yes. I'm not big on fighting games. My apologies. I know fighting game people love fighting games. I do not mean to offend you. I respect you a lot. Evo is very cool. I'm sorry.
Evo's happening next month.
Next month?
Next week.
That is awesome. I'm so happy for you because it seems I'm jealous, but I know nothing about in-depth fighting, the fighting game. But like just being able to see this is promising something. This is promising to build up to a huge, explosive, fast fight, but then it never delivers and something is lost. It's not meant to, again, it is a training mode, but it is a great example of what can happen. I think a really extreme example of this that can really prove the point are when bugs just collapse the experience from under you. I found this bug where you have to fight a T-posing bear inside Skyrim. Come on, YouTube. I promised so much, thank you. And like, you can see the hit flashes on screen and like the blood effects from your attacks, like the combat is still completely functioning there. The bear's attacking you, you're attacking it, but we all just laughed and you're fighting a bear. In a game that does a pretty good job at building up atmosphere and executing. And so bugs are an excellent example, but I guess we're gonna just watch it again. Oh no! Ooh, yes, thank you. Oh, hilarious. And you even level up thanks to this little bear. Excellent. Now, this is important to remember because this can happen just by design, by accidental design inside your experience. You need to keep your pacing in your game to avoid this one. I love Resident Evil 4. It is one of my top 3 games of all time, and especially the remake was super clutch. This is the original. It was a sad day for me when I watched Resident Evil 4 speedrun for the first time. I'm going to spoil something for you. I hope I haven't ruined anything. I think they may have designed it out in the remake, but you can run by everything. You don't actually have to fight anything in that game. You can just stagger step and swoop around them, and none of it actually matters. And then when you realize that, and it's the risk of watching a speedrun, you are purposefully collapsing the illusion that you want to buy into. So to avoid this, you need to keep your pacing, you need to keep players engaged, never let your enemies do nothing. It is something I say every day when we're reviewing our AI behavior inside our game. Never be doing nothing. It's also true for players. If they have a moment where they aren't having to actually engage in the system, they are observers and not participants, and once they are observers, they can see all the smoke and mirrors that you have tactically set up. It's like being backstage on a really impressive play production. The illusion of the town and the front side of all the set that they have constructed is just completely lost when you see it from the side or behind. I see a question. Sure, let's do it.
What do you feel about games that are sort of defined by their bugs and glitches? Like, for example, Team Fortress 2, like every single class in the game, a player can have the class like A pose just by completing like a simple bug at any time, and people love seeing A posing classes because they just think it's funny as hell.
I think there's, again, it doesn't apply to every game. I think breaking the illusion on purpose for comedic effect, or like Team Fortress 2 is it transcends what's actually in the game. It's a cultural experience beyond it, and people are buying and find humor in that experience, and it's not trying to craft that illusion as much. It still can if you're in the detail there, but they're happy to just, it's been around so far, like, yeah, that dude's wearing a weird hat, we want to sell that to you, goodbye illusion. It's really about keeping the player inside that facade that you're trying to craft. And there are exceptions, like Goat Simulator, I think is a great, that game is a bug, like it's just a bug. Everything breaks, but it's on purpose, and they're breaking the fourth wall in a way through that. And ultimately, you want to keep combat moving. A thing that I'm trying to do more and more in D&D or in the combats I'm developing is like end combat when player has won. There might be things alive, and there might be more to do, but that is not interesting when the interesting decisions have ended. The combat should end. And that prevents this moment from the players can like look around and watch the AI of the last goblin who's still alive, like still throwing spears at you, and you see it for what it is. And so just don't let combat enter a role. This is on the enemies as much as it is the players. Keep them engaged, make sure they keep moving. I think a more concrete example of this is if you're developing an enemy and you need to put some space in between their attacks. You need to edit their pacing. Like, they can't just stand there. They can't commit their combo and then stand there. You need to still craft that illusion. Make them taunt the player, make them fidget with their gun, right? Make the gun jam, make them reposition slowly so they're not really getting away from you. They're still roughly in the same spot, but you need to maintain that illusion. Lesson 8, know what you challenge. I'm seeing people who aren't oohing and eyeing, and I'll remember that when networking starts. Just know that. This might have been your last chance, so sorry. This will be on the test. It's important to know that your game is going to test certain skills. They're going to test it of the player, and that's kind of what you want to focus on, and so you should know what these skills are. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to challenge other skills when your players, I don't know why I have these one at a time. I don't have a better view to know what's coming up ahead. I'm trying to look like a smooth operator here and flow through them fluidly, and I just kept piling up. I apologize. So your game tests certain skills. You need to know what those skills are. You should identify them probably day one, if I'm being honest. And you don't want to challenge other skills. You want to focus on what this core identity of your game is. And you want to craft your combat around those skills that you want to focus on, because your target market is going to see that game and be like, I have those skills, I want to test them. And they want to play your game for those specific skills. And if you're throwing weird curveballs at them, you're going to frustrate them and disappoint them. I think any game that has a sliding tile puzzle does this to me every single time. It's easy to implement. It'll be fun. We'll just throw it in and give a nice curveball to the player. But after like 20 hours of Legend of Zelda getting really good at sailing and dungeon diving, I don't want to spend 20 minutes honestly randomly moving tiles. I don't know anyone who is actually actively doing these things. And like, if you take it to an extreme and your like PvP shooter has you pick a lock by doing a sliding tile puzzle, nothing else in the game is leading up to this moment. Has nothing to do with all of the hours of tutorialization and practice I've had as a player. Now there's novelty to this, and indie games particularly like to play with this, and they can be done to a specific effect. But at the end of the day, it should, I would say, shouldn't be under Critical Path. It should be an optional side thing, which, to be fair, it was in Wind Waker. I'm not going to throw shade at it. I think it's an excellent game, but it is an excellent example in my book. And this is a simple concept. Like, yeah, our game's about this. We should make it about this. But it's a little harder in practice. Sometimes it's unclear what mechanics test, particularly if you're in a genre because you like that genre. You're not really thinking about it as critically from the ground up, right? If you're really into shooters, you just say headshot. But are you really conceptualizing it as testing the player's precision for lining up that headshot? Because that's really more of what it is. Sometimes good ideas don't fit. There's design space there that you want to capitalize on. Or again, going back to the lesson, if you develop what's in front of you, you might want to throw in different curveballs into the experience. That sliding tile puzzle may seem like a fun little side project you can throw into your bigger project, but it's not going to fit. It doesn't necessarily mean it has a home. It can be confusing because sometimes your main core reference games that are a big part of what your inspiration is, or the best comparison in the industry, shouldn't be one-to-one, or shouldn't be a perfect blueprint for what your experience is. If you have a game that wholesale you are trying to duplicate, you're going to just remind people to go play that game at the end of the day. So this can come back to bite you, where I think this happens a lot when we say things like, it's a Souls-like, and Souls-like means so many different things, and then it means so many different things to different people, and because you say, I want to take the permadeath stuff from a Souls-like game, and you start copying, the animation-based combat system or the dreadful tone because you have conflated those things, you kind of lost something there. You're doing yourself a disservice. And ultimately, you have to give up design space. And I think that can be the hardest thing. You see potential in something cool. Someone's like, what if this is a match 3 game? Like, as an offhand comment, you're like, oh my God, that actually works. You can't dump your project. Indie projects, passion projects are different. You can totally just pivot. But at a larger company, a larger project, a project further along, you can't just dive into something that has potential. You need to execute. So we face this on Agents of Mayhem. Agents of Mayhem has guns. You shoot things. It looks like a shooter. What we found in actuality is it's not first and foremost a shooter. It is an action game with shooting. I don't remember who coined that term. I think it might have been me, and I'm pretty proud of it, but I don't want to take credit for something I didn't do. But really, the precision you would expect from a shooter, that 360 no-scope headshot moment, was a secondary skill. We still had some of it, but we minimized it inside of the experience. Instead, we tested more your positioning and your awareness. You're often surrounded, and all the enemy attacks are projectiles that are moving through space. They have a lot of AoE attacks with tells on the floor. You're paying back to the hierarchy of information, you're paying way more attention to where you are relative to the enemies, relative to their attacks. And this ultimately was confusing for development because the way we were messaging it, even internally, even before our marketing campaign started, early on in the project, people saw the guns and we were putting emphasis on we are a studio that has gun gameplay. And we spent, there's this weird through line where one of our early characters had 2 pistols, dual wield. And our mechanics have like explicit range systems. So, and we needed for balance that this person with 2 pistols at medium range would have a low hit rate. And someone on the team who was expecting this to be a shooter was very perturbed, confused, off-put by the fact that these pistols weren't as accurate as pistols would be in real life. In theory, pistols should have a high amount of accuracy to medium to long ranges, and there was dissonance there. And we talked specifically about that at full team meetings for like an hour at a time. And really what we should have just been doing is clarifying what the skills we're testing are, what we care about in the combat experience. And actually, once we like honed that in for the team at large and communicated it out, those conversations stopped and people understood what we were going for. But we had this muddy definition of what the experience was. So pick your skills early and make sure you communicate it. That is the takeaway too, like identify what skills you test. That defines it for the target market, that defines it for your team, and helps you create a consistent experience. Okay, and last time, you guys ready? No, I didn't do it yet! I didn't do it! We've been practicing this whole time! It's amateur hour, come on! You're letting me down, okay. That was all my lessons. Questions, question mark? Questions? Exclamation point. I didn't do that. I copied that slide in last minute. Didn't know it had animations. Thank you, Papyrus Lessons slide or template from Slides Go. I'm required to have this slide at the end of my presentation.
All right. Questions?
We talked a lot about documentation earlier in the night. How do you plan out and write design docs for characters with multiple abilities?
Oh, for characters specifically?
Yeah.
I'm going to have an unsatisfying answer for you. The design documentation that works is the one that works. The reality is how you approach design documentation is somewhat dependent on your project, but very dependent on your team. We use Miro a lot to communicate general ideas. We have a lot of person-to-person conversations. I walk people through Miro boards to organize thoughts. Like you can have, your abilities grouped up as Post-it notes. For anyone who doesn't know, Miro is just a digital whiteboard thing. So you can group boxes in Post-it notes and have a spatial element. And that helps communicate like more vibes to people. And then we have a in-depth one-sheet process where it functions as a focused design document for whatever the feature is. I rarely write big design. I write big design documents for external uses when an investor or a publisher asks for it. I rarely write it internally because one, we're maintaining the build, and two, no one reads them. No one has ever read any documentation. I write our one sheets, I use only bullet points, and I try to make it as concise to the relevant information as possible. And even then, half the stuff gets missed. I'm like, where's bullet point number 3? We need to develop that. So how do I organize it? I kind of have a one-size-fits-all for the one sheet. It adapts it to what it is. I start with the goals. I'm explicit about what I want to get out of this feature from an experiential standpoint. It can be as a developer or as a player. Like this needs to be a tool for level designers down the road, just as much as I want the player to feel like a badass or whatever the goals are. Then I do what is the term called, form and function, where I still all bullet points and try to keep it somewhat short sentences. I tell the story of what the feature is. I think that's really important when you're communicating with your team. You want to sell them on the idea, less the functionality, the detail. One mistake I made throughout a lot of my design career is I led with, I wanted to prove I got this design down, and I lead with the intricacies, and I'm like, but you see that this mechanic is then interacting with this mechanic, and then if you have this feature and represent it with this UI, and everyone's like, but is it a grenade? And I'm like, yeah, it's a grenade. It's a grenade, right? So you want to start with that because that primes the person's mind for what they're doing. And then we do how it works, which is an in-depth, if you were to implement it, this is what's important. I don't do technical side of it, maybe design workflow side of it. And this is going to be applied to anyone. If things need to be broken down in sections, we do one sheets for each section. So it's really about just compartmentalizing that information and making it into bite-sized chunks. So for a character, I'll have they'll have an overview of what the experience is, and then I won't get into how it works because how it works is individual one sheets under that, and that really functions more like our design doc. I have design pillars, I have larger design docs, but they just honestly are less effective internally. Yes.
Yeah. So now that you mention kinetic energy and how it's goes into the combat system.
Yeah.
So when designing your combat, how do you make it in a way where the game isn't too easy when the players sort of cool, stylish,
right?
Or again just powerful without again making the game too easy? Because I've seen a lot of games where they have a really cool combat system and stylish, but it's kind of too easy in a way. Right.
It's flashy.
Yeah,
as opposed to
example Vanilla Kingdom Hearts 2, where combo was sort of butt and mushy.
You're rolling, there's bubble particle effects. Donna's like, sorry, no. Yeah, I get it. I know, I've been there. The impact of a combat is interesting because it is just as much about the contrast and when the player feels weak as it is when they feel powerful. If everything's loud and explosive, nothing's loud and explosive. So if you want that challenge, you need that moment when the player is put on their back foot, where they are staggered and knocked down, and it's not just I don't feel strong enough. Let's juice it further. As far as balancing it, that's our CEO said this, and it's very insightful. That can get a little difficulty. You need to, when you're going back to iterating early, making sure you are adding the challenge in and balancing the numbers earlier to actually get that. One hard thing about combat, so many things are coming together that the combat doesn't really come together in its final form until about 70% through production, which is kind of the surprising thing. So how do you make it challenging early? Develop AI, hire an AI engineer, right? Because that's where the challenge comes in, right? You can develop all these players. This is great. This is an application of a question where I'm just going through all the lessons learned. AI is hard. Develop what's in front of you. Man, I lost my train of thought because I got so excited for there for a second. I felt so validated it overcame my logic. Spending less time on those features where you're being explosive and spending more time on they're actually using them to fight. Right? If you have less abilities or less flashy ability, but you have a compelling dueling partner, that combat's going to feel better than that really explosive flash.
Kind of playing off of that, at what point in the process do you kind of decide if there's like scaling for challenge levels?
Yes.
And then how do you go about deciding like the implementation of that?
Yeah, the real answer is way more complicated and depends on scope and like your team makeup and your milestones. But the like shortened version is I'm sorry, I totally just blanked. I'm getting tired.
No, you're good.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so like at what point in the development process do you figure out kind of like if there's going to be challenge levels like easy?
And the scaling.
Yeah, and then like.
So what you want to do is you want to start with your core experience, right? Like what is the experience you want, 70% of your players to hit and find that good challenge level. And then you're going to push it. You're going to try to find, anytime in general design, you want to find the center, then define the walls. You want to, I call it velociraptoring it, where you test the fences. And you knew what I was talking about.
Yeah.
Okay. So you find the core, and then you're okay. What is the easiest version of this, and then what's the hardest version of that? And then scaling between it is much more nuanced, game specific. Like if you have dynamic scaling based off of the player's level, a la like Skyrim, or if it's something that you pre-set up and they're opting into a challenge. It'd be good to like set that up in gyms. Like when you define your core combat, and then you if you have the engineering bandwidth, create infrastructure where you can do A/B testing or two sets of balancing and stats, so that you can incorporate into your weekly playtest because you maintain a variable that can iterate on it.
How do you communicate effectively when it seems like a lot of these principles touch all of the departments in the studio, and so it's like, the programmers need to do this, the artists need to do this, and the artists need to do this. Like, how do you get on the same page effectively?
We did some interviews recently, and it's different studio to studio. Some places really like where you have the very pristine document or brief, usually, and then you're like throwing it over the wall, and especially if you have contractors. There's some developers that appreciate that. There's some people who you need to be in a room and you need to boot up the game and all look at it at the same time. The answer is people are different, and it's about cultivating your team culture around it. If you don't always have that luxury. I'm understanding the Wolverine soft context you're speaking to, you need to adapt and you need to try multiple things. Get a spreadsheet of all the people on the team and record how they like to communicate and reference that. Like at Volition, you'd be like, this engineer, I need to talk to them directly or they won't absorb a DM. This person needs some sort of visual element or presentation. I'll call a meeting and come in. You just have to be tactical about it. Like 50% of your job as a designer is just pure communication. And so you do have to bend over backwards to make sure that people understand it. Your product is so theoretical compared to engineers and artists as they make like tangible things come a reality. And you're like, but this is how I want it to feel. And so your job is to like make sure they understand that. It's hard. Like there could be a whole nother talk on just what your tools are to communicate it and what different versions of one sheets or presentations or Miro boards or mood boards or 8 different types of documentation or effective JIRA tasking to keep people focused. Like answers all of it. I'm sorry. Like I'm sorry. Was this related to this point? Is that yours related to this point?
Not as much.
Okay, we'll go with Corbin then. I swear, you'll be next. Okay.
Just side note.
Yeah.
It makes me smile and laugh because you gave a talk here forever ago.
Yeah.
Talking about getting into like as a designer and joining that, and you stressed soft skills so much.
I remember it was an hour and 40 minutes of a presentation. I was talking about how to format emails. Yeah. Everyone's like, I want to be a designer. What's this?
They matter so much. Yeah. And I think it's it's really important to just stress like people are people. And so that's great.
I think the most successful version of this was we hired the team with our production style in mind, less someone's individual skills. And this has been the smoothest it is. And still my full-time job is management at this point. Yeah. We have daily pod meetings where I can Q&A, we're looking at the build, we're checking tasks, we're doing all these things inside focus moments. And even then, things are still falling through the cracks, and the other things like, we're not gonna get it perfect, oh, the engineer missed this part from the bullet point list, whatever, make a task for it, just circle back, this is gonna happen.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So
actually, let's go over here. No, I'm kidding.
So something that's kind of bugged me. So artists have portfolios.
Yes.
I don't know what engineers have, but something
GitHub
I'm curious about is what do designers have when they're applying for jobs?
Good question. Get to me when you find out the answer. No. The answer is it depends on your design school, what type of designer you are. You can display that information in different ways. Is there a specific one you're asking for, a specific type of design? I can speak more specifically.
I think something similar to what you're doing, because I enjoy action games.
Action games?
So.
Yeah. It can be really hard, right? Like, you have to show the validity of your work. For design, the good fallback is show your work for something. Like, I don't really, like, I know it's hard to make a game. I don't expect anyone applying to create a full, to show off design, you need the whole game constructed and then for someone to experience it. I don't expect people to do that. But even if you were like your critical strike system, you know, you can theoretically communicate, because I'm hiring a designer to communicate an idea that isn't yet implemented. If you can you can communicate this theoretical idea, show your work, you know, have flow charts, mock-ups, documentation and presentation, and like talk about you talking about it, be like, this is a document that is, you know, this is how it works for how we describe something to an engineer and break down the functionality of it. So you can show me that. That's what I'm hiring you for, right? Like, especially in a junior position, I'm not gonna like hire you on and be like, cool, direct the game, right? Which like you have to do when you start a new project. For action-y things, if you have any amount of programming skills, but I always, like, I wish I did more of when I was getting a portfolio together, isolate something you want to emulate. Like, someone, I remember when God of War 1 came out, God of War 2018 came out, they're like, I'm going to recreate the axe returning system inside Unreal. And they just had the mannequin and they bought an axe asset, and they figured, and this is more for engineering, but I think it serves, like, I wouldn't suggest this for design. Like you throw it in, it comes back, and they learned so much, and they talked about what they learned, and they showed their prototypes, and they talked about why they think it's impactful and the theory behind it, and it's like, yes, like this is what you actually do on the job, not just have a polished project at the end of it. So, like, if you want to talk about game feel, like, isolate camera shake.
Okay.
And say how you're utilizing it. Or you know, use game kits, use mods, shortcut any way you can actually get to showing off your design, and then really just like break it down. Like since 50% of communication, if you can effectively communicate whatever it is you did, that's a huge bonus.
So theoretically, it's not enough just to show gameplay, because I think I have the problem where I have the gameplay but not the documentation.
Yeah, well, if you're applying for a design position, a lot of design, depending where, especially if you're at a big company, like the amount of scripting you need to know is some, but not, you're not making the game yourself. And so, like, that transition from indie development to like AA, AAA design development is a really hard jump, because indie development, you do a little bit of everything, and design's like, let's do this very esoteric, theoretical nonsense and then communicate it. And this is just jumping from it. I say nonsense lovingly, it's what I do every day.
That's what I want to do the most, is just the design stuff, but then I'm stuck with like my elementary school programming skills and trying to make something.
Throws out like mod something, even do paper develop, like a board game or something. If you're like a turn-based game, could be a board game just as easy as something digital. The amount of polish you need to get in for someone looking at portfolio to have a satisfying experience is just astronomical. It is not worth your time. You won't actually learn any of the skills you're going to need to apply on the job. So, and that's someone who's done that.
Okay, final questions? Final question?
What are your favorite personal combat systems that you've played and one of your least favorite?
Oh, favorites. Okay, easy. This is easy. So you thought you had me. This is an easy question. One of my least favorite combat systems, not because it was bad, but I found it really interesting, was recently, what was that rhythm-based combat game that came out this year? Hi-Fi Rush. I have high-functioning anxiety, and the overwhelming like thrumming of the music and it in the environment gave me like heart palpitations. Yeah. And I don't think it was bad. It was my least favorite, but I don't think it was bad. I just literally couldn't play it. I thought it was really interesting. Like, oh, like I should. For my career, I should play this game, but I'm gonna go to sleep now. And one of my favorite that it's incredible. Okay, how much time do we have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, easy. So. One of my favorite, I mentioned it, is Resident Evil 4. I think it did such interesting things. The debate of should you strafe is no, you shouldn't, because they purposely didn't want you to strafe, and it does interesting things. It does really, this notion of a shooter that's more about like crowd control and tension than like headshot and running and feeling badass and using it for horror things while still being an action game, hit this like really cool balance. And then what's, I'm always really excited for things that get big iterations. I think that's really good design deep dives to study. Things like Magic the Gathering that's been iterated on for 30 years and refined, Dungeons and Dragons, World of Warcraft. They've like, people who have effectively iterated on it have seen the problems and attempted to iron them out or attempted something else and it didn't work and it came back, and you rarely get to see that. A game might get one sequel and then like there's cool ideas there and they're just left hanging. Resident Evil 4 with the recent remake captures a lot of the same emotions in a more modern package, and it's really interesting to see what they left behind and what they kept and still had all those intense emotions, and it looks great and it's still kind of silly, but the tone is different, but it's still the same formula. It's really I'll come back next month and have my Resident Evil 4 talk. Okay. And just like, you suplex this guy, it's so dumb.
Jordan, this is fantastic. Thank you much for sharing your knowledge with us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, everyone.